My parents missed my wedding, but not because of an emergency. They skipped it for a casual lunch at my sister's house. That was the day I realized blood doesn't always mean loyalty. It's strange how something as supposedly joyful as your wedding day can turn into the most painful moment of your life. I remember standing at the end of the aisle, bouquet trembling in my hands, my eyes locked on the doors, willing them to open. I had told myself for weeks not to expect too much, not to hope, but still, some foolish part of me clung to the idea that my parents would show up, that they'd choose me just this once, but they didn't. While I was pacing the bridal suite trying to calm my nerves, they were smiling in photos at my sister's house, laughing over salad and champagne. I found out when a cousin showed me her Instagram post mid-reception. I wish I could say I was surprised that it came out of nowhere, but the truth is, this wasn't the first time they picked her over me. It was just the last straw, the one that broke whatever thread of hope I had left. I'm Rachel, I'm 27, and this is how I learned that sometimes letting go of your family is the only way to find peace. Growing up, love in my house felt like a silent agreement, unspoken but heavy. I believed I had it, the way children believe the sun will rise tomorrow, and in some ways I did. My earliest memories are of quiet evenings curled up next to my dad while he read the newspaper, one arm slung around me absent-mindedly. He smelled like motor oil and spearmint gum, and I thought he was the smartest man in the world. On weekends, we'd go to flea markets and search for treasures, old radios, worn-out vinyl records, things he'd fix in the garage, while I handed him tools. He called me his little helper, and in those moments, I felt like his whole world. My mom was the heart of our home. She was warm, efficient, and emotionally unreadable. Her affection was in the meals she cooked, the laundry she folded, and the band-aids she applied without complaint. I didn't hear "I love you" often, but when she tucked me in at night, smoothing my blanket with care, it felt like a whispered version of it. I was the second child. Danielle, my sister, arrived 2 years earlier and took up all the space I never thought to claim. She was magnetic in a way I wasn't. Loud, daring, messy, and completely unapologetic. People adored her, my parents adored her. But she adored me too, at least back then. We were close as kids. She taught me how to paint my nails, how to sneak extra dessert, and how to fake a stomachache to skip school. She was my protector and my idol, and I was her shadow. I didn't mind following. I liked being near her. Things started to change in middle school. Danielle's charisma became defiance. She skipped classes, dated older boys, and lied about where she was going. My parents bent themselves in circles trying to excuse her behavior. "She's passionate," Dad would say. "She just needs space," Mom added. When I got a 98 on my math exam, I received a quiet nod. When Danielle passed her driving test after 3 tries, they threw her a surprise dinner. Still, I never resented her. I just tried harder. I thought if I worked twice as much, they'd see me. I joined the debate team, volunteered at the animal shelter, and maintained a 4 GPA. I was polite, helpful, and invisible. When it came time to apply for college, I got into a prestigious university across the country. I was ready to go, to finally have something that was mine. But 2 weeks before the semester started, Mom sat me down in the kitchen, her eyes tired. "Your grandmother's health is declining," she said, "and Danielle isn't here. We need you." I deferred my admission and told myself it was temporary. I enrolled in a local college and stayed home. Uh, I picked up a part-time job and started handling the errands no one asked Danielle to do. Even after I graduated, the pattern continued. Danielle floated through life, job to job, relationship to relationship, always landing on her feet. I, on the other hand, became the family's built-in caregiver, counselor, and wallet. And through it all, I still believed that if I just held on long enough, gave enough, sacrificed enough, they'd finally see me. They'd say the words I'd been aching to hear, "You matter just as much." But that day never came. Instead, it became a series of quiet heartbreaks. Dad asking about Danielle every time I called, Mom forgetting my work promotion, their smiles bigger for her smallest gestures than for my biggest achievements. I thought I was being loyal. I thought love was measured by how much you could endure. Now I realize I was just teaching them how little they had to give me in return. At first, it was subtle, so subtle, in fact, that I convinced myself I was imagining it. It started with chores. My parents would ask me to help clean up after dinner while Danielle scrolled on her phone or disappeared into her room. If I pointed it out, Mom would say, "Huh, she had a long day," or "You're just better at tidying." It was always said with a light tone, like it was a compliment. But over time, the imbalance became impossible to ignore. Then came the emotional erasure. When I got promoted at work, I sent a message in our family group chat. It was a big deal. I'd been working hard for years waiting for that opportunity. Hours passed. Nothing, not even a thumbs up. Danielle posted a selfie later that day with her new haircut, and suddenly the chat lit up. So pretty. "You look amazing." My mom even texted me separately, "Your sister looks so grown up, doesn't she?" I stared at the screen, unsure whether to laugh or cry. When Danielle needed help moving into her new apartment, everyone rallied. Dad rented a truck, Mom brought sandwiches, I helped too, of course. But when I moved into a small place with my boyfriend months later, I did it alone. No one asked if I needed boxes or gas money, not even a "good luck." Still, I told myself they loved me in their own way. I clung to scraps, an occasional compliment, a birthday call, a shared memory. But those moments were fleeting, and the disparities kept piling up. One evening, Danielle dropped by the house unannounced, all teary-eyed. She claimed she was worried about me and that she thought I was getting into bad stuff, drugs, drinking. When my parents confronted me the next morning, their expressions were tight with concern. I was stunned. I'd never touched drugs in my life, but they didn't ask questions, they just assumed she was right. "I'll take a test," I said immediately. "Right now, whatever you want." They didn't respond. It didn't matter that I worked 2 jobs, that I was barely sleeping, trying to juggle my life and still support them. They looked at me like a stranger. My dad finally said, "We just want you to be honest." That cut deeper than any accusation. I took the test anyway, clean of course, but no apology ever came. Not even a quiet acknowledgement that maybe they'd been wrong. After that, I stopped trying so hard. I didn't volunteer for every errand, I stopped texting updates, I spent more time at my boyfriend's place. When I was home, I felt like a guest in my own family. Danielle would make snide comments like, "Wow, you remembered we exist," and Mom would laugh like it was charming instead of cruel. When my boyfriend and I got engaged, I told my parents over dinner. They blinked and said, "Oh, that's nice." Then they changed the subject to Danielle's latest dog adoption. I wasn't expecting a parade, but I wasn't expecting silence either. They posted about the dog on Facebook, shared photos, wrote captions like the newest member of the family. Meanwhile, I was planning a wedding and they hadn't even asked about the date. I kept hoping it would shift, that some major event would snap them out of it, but as time went on, the reality became clearer. It wasn't that they didn't notice, it was that they didn't care enough to. Being treated like a backup plan wears you down. You start to question everything, your worth, your sanity, your memories. I spent so long trying to be good, to be useful, thinking maybe if I just held on a little longer, they'd finally see me. But they didn't, and I was starting to wonder if they ever would. I used to believe that if I just kept showing up, being kind, responsible, dependable, my parents would eventually meet me halfway, that if I gave them enough time, they'd finally see me not as Danielle's quieter shadow, but as someone worthy of the same love. That illusion shattered on the day of my wedding. It wasn't a grand affair, nothing lavish or showy, just a modest venue with string lights, a rented archway, and the people who mattered most. Or at least, the ones I thought would matter most. We'd spent months planning it all. Every detail had intention. The playlist, the menu, even the color of the napkins. I wanted warmth, intimacy, sincerity. I didn't care about flash. I just wanted a family. I wanted my parents to see me begin a new chapter, surrounded by love. When we sent the invites, I included a handwritten letter in my parents' envelope. It would mean everything to have you there, I wrote, pressing hard into the paper. I meant every word. A week passed. Then two. When I finally called to follow up, my mom's voice was casual, too casual. We're not sure we can make it, she said, like we were discussing a dentist appointment. I blinked, stunned. Why? Well, Danielle's planning something that weekend, just a little family lunch. I waited for the punchline. There wasn't one. You're choosing a lunch over my wedding? She didn't know it was the same day, and we already committed. She's really excited about it. I couldn't breathe for a second. You can't be serious. It's just a lunch, she said, as if that made it better, but it means a lot to her. And I don't? Silence. I don't remember how the rest of the call ended. I just remember sitting on my couch in the dark, the wedding folder on my lap, the RSVP line from their cards still blank. My fiancé tried to console me, but even he was in disbelief. Surely they'll come, he said. They can't actually mean that. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. In the days leading up to the wedding, I convinced myself it was a misunderstanding, that they'd show up at the last minute, that this was some weird family hiccup and not a complete collapse. I reminded myself they were my parents, that they had to care. But hope is a dangerous thing when it rests on people who've never earned it. The morning of the wedding, I woke up early, my best friend brought coffee, my hair and makeup team arrived. Laughter filled the bridal suite, but I felt like I was underwater. Every time the door opened, my heart jumped. They'll be here, I told myself. They'll come. Guests started arriving. My fiancé was already at the altar. I was supposed to walk at 3:30. At 3:20, I checked my phone again. Nothing. 3:35, still nothing. Then a message from my cousin popped up. Are your parents not coming? They're at Danielle's lunch. RN just posted pics. I opened Instagram. There they were. My mom and dad in Danielle's kitchen, sipping mimosas, smiling. The caption, family time is everything. I wanted to scream. Instead, I felt a calmness I can't explain, like my body gave up on feeling and just went numb. I walked down the aisle at 3:45 without them. The ceremony is a blur. I remember my husband's eyes, the way he held my hand so tight. I remember the breeze picking up my veil. I remember the empty chairs where they were supposed to sit. After the ceremony, I stepped outside alone. I stared at the message again. The photo, their faces full of joy, at a brunch, while I stood there in a white dress, the loneliest I'd ever felt. That night, still in my gown, I wrote a message to my parents. You've made your choice. I won't chase after people who don't choose me. Please don't contact me again. It wasn't angry, it wasn't dramatic, it was honest. The next day, I woke up to missed calls, texts, voicemails. I didn't realize how much it mattered to you, my mom said in one message. If you had told us it was this serious, we might have reconsidered, said another. There was no apology, just excuses, just gaslighting. Danielle texted too, you're being childish, it was one day. Yes, it was one day I needed them. One day I asked for nothing but presence. And they chose absence. For weeks after, I questioned myself, was I overreacting? Should I have just let it go? But every time I tried to soften, I remembered that photo, their smiles, the caption, family time is everything, everything except when it's mine. So I did the hardest thing I've ever done. I closed the door. Blocked their numbers. I erased their names from our seating chart in the wedding album. I stopped explaining, stopped hoping, stopped hurting, at least in the way they'd taught me to. That day didn't just break something in me, it freed something too. Because now I finally understood. I wasn't losing a family. I was releasing the illusion of one I never really had. I used to believe that love, even imperfect love, could be mended if you just tried hard enough. If I kept showing up, being reliable, being supportive, being understanding, my parents would eventually stop treating me like a backup option. that they would finally stop making me feel like Danielle's understudy in the play of our family. But that illusion shattered in the most public, most painful way possible on my wedding day. It wasn't a lavish affair, we couldn't afford that, and truthfully, we didn't want it. My fiance and I had chosen a beautiful little vineyard for the ceremony with string lights and lavender sprigs tied to each chair. It felt intimate and intentional, like the life we were building together. We sent out invitations 6 months in advance with thoughtful notes tucked inside. I wrote one especially for my parents in my own handwriting. No matter what's happened, I'd love for you to be there. They didn't respond for weeks. Then one afternoon, my mom called. There's a bit of a conflict, she said lightly, like we were rescheduling a dentist appointment. Danielle is planning a lunch that weekend, just something at her place, a little family gathering. I felt my stomach drop. But you know my wedding is that Saturday, right? Yes, sweetheart, but Danielle's event is on the same day, and she's already invited people. We don't want to disappoint her. Couldn't even speak at first. It was like hearing bad news in a foreign language. Your mind understands, but your heart refuses. She really needs us right now, Mom added. And I don't? I asked. It came out quieter than I'd meant it to. She sighed as if I was being unreasonable. This isn't about picking sides, but it was. And they picked. Still, I didn't remove their names from the seating chart. I left 2 seats open in the front row. My fiance kept asking if I wanted to fill them with someone else, maybe a mentor, maybe his aunt who had been like a second mom to me. But I said no. I couldn't let go of the tiny sliver of hope. The morning of the wedding, everything was beautiful. The sky was clear, the air warm. My best friend helped me get ready, brushing out my veil and trying to distract me with stories from college. But I kept looking at the clock. At 2:45, the coordinator said most of the guests had arrived. I asked to wait another 10 minutes. Then 15. At 3:15, my cousin sent me a text. Are your parents not coming? Then another, a screenshot of Danielle's Instagram story. There they were. My mom, my dad, Danielle, posing next to a 3-tier cake with "Family First" in scripted icing. Champagne glasses in hand, smiles are too wide. It felt like being punched in the chest. I couldn't breathe. At 3:30, I walked down the aisle alone. People clapped, I said my vows, I kissed my husband, but all I remember is the way those 2 chairs in the front row stayed empty, and how even in that moment, part of me still wished they'd come running in, breathless and apologizing. But they didn't. At the reception, I barely touched my food. I smiled in the photos. I danced. I laughed in the way people do when their soul has left the building. Later that night, when the guests were gone and the stars had come out, I sat alone on the edge of the patio and stared at that Instagram post again. Family first. I typed a message to my parents. You didn't show up, not just today, but every day leading up to it. Don't contact me again. Then I blocked their numbers. The next morning, my inbox exploded. Voicemails, texts, emails. Not a single one said, I'm sorry, justifications, excuses. You didn't tell us it meant that much to you. You know how Danielle gets when she's overwhelmed. You're being too sensitive. Danielle messaged too, you're acting like a brat, it's just a wedding. Just a wedding. Just the day I vowed my life to someone in front of everyone I loved, except the people who were supposed to love me first. That weekend became the line in the sand, the moment I stopped being their daughter. Not legally, not biologically, but spiritually and emotionally. I was done trying to earn a seat at a table I'd never been invited to sit at. I deleted the family group chat. I stopped forwarding updates. I removed their emergency contacts from my phone. People say weddings are about beginnings. Mine was also an end. Not of love, but of illusion. I finally saw my parents for who they were. Not cruel, but consistently careless. Not malicious, but willfully blind. They didn't hate me, they just didn't value me enough to show up. And in that, I found a strange kind of peace. Because the day I stopped hoping was the day I started healing. After the wedding, after the final glass was cleared and the music faded, I felt like I'd stepped into a vacuum. No parents, no messages, just a wall of quiet that stretched endlessly. I had expected something, anger, regret, even an apology, but there was nothing. In that silence, the weight of everything I had carried for years finally came crashing down. At first, I tried to distract myself. I threw myself into organizing the thank you notes, rearranging the furniture in our apartment, and diving into work with the kind of manic energy that only barely kept the darkness at bay. But grief has a way of finding you in the quiet hours. At night, I'd lie awake next to my husband, staring at the ceiling, replaying moments from the wedding. The two empty chairs, the picture of Danielle's brunch, the smile on my mom's face as she toasted someone else's big day. I stopped checking my phone. I didn't want to see another text from Danielle accusing me of being dramatic. I didn't want to read another vague email from my mom beginning with, "We never meant to hurt you," and ending with reasons why I was to blame. Eventually, this sadness turned into something heavier. Numbness. I stopped cooking. I stopped seeing friends. I told my boss I needed time off, and for once, I didn't bother making up a reason. I just said I couldn't function. And I couldn't. My husband tried everything. He brought home flowers, ran me baths, made my favorite meals. One night, I found him in the kitchen, crying quietly. "I don't know how to help you," he said, and I had no answer. I started therapy a few weeks later. I remember my first session vividly. I told the therapist everything about growing up in Danielle's shadow, about how I sacrificed parts of myself just to be acknowledged, about the wedding and the no-show and the heartbreak. She listened, she asked questions, and then she said something that broke me. "It sounds like you've been grieving the loss of a family you never truly had." I cried for nearly 20 minutes after that. Because it was true, I wasn't just grieving the wedding, I was grieving a lifetime of being almost loved, almost seen, almost valued. I had been holding out hope that one day they would choose me, that one day they would show up, and when they didn't, I finally had to face the truth. There were days I didn't get out of bed, days I wore the same clothes for too long, days I picked fights with my husband, not because he'd done anything wrong, but because I didn't know where else to put all the pain. He never walked away, he just held me, again and again, whispering, "You're worth more than how they treated you." Slowly, therapy helped me build language around what I was feeling. It wasn't just sadness, it was a betrayal, it was abandonment, it was the erosion of identity. Who was I if I wasn't the daughter trying to make everything okay? I started journaling. The pages filled quickly, rage, sorrow, fragments of memories. I wrote letters I never sent to my mother, my father, my sister. I wrote out everything I wished they'd said to me, everything I had wanted for so long but never got. Some nights I'd still wake up crying, but other nights I started to dream again. Tiny moments became victories. Washing my hair, going for a walk, smiling at a neighbor. My husband began to notice, "You laughed today," he said once, and it felt like I had won something. The climb out of that hole wasn't linear. Some days I fell back in, but now I had tools, I had words, I had people who didn't require me to bleed in order to earn their love. And that slowly, painfully began to make all the difference. What surprised me most during this time was how much shame I carried. Shame for still want their approval. Shame for feeling broken when I had so much else to be grateful for. A good husband, a stable job, a roof over my head. But trauma doesn't keep score the way logic does. It doesn't care about perspective. It sits in your bones until you name it, until you let it rise. And part of naming it was confronting what I had tolerated for years. The backhanded compliments, the subtle exclusions, the way my triumphs were ignored while Danielle's every minor success was paraded like a national holiday. I had made excuses for them. They're just tired. They don't mean it. Danielle needs more help. But deep down, I had known. I had always known. Now there was no more pretending. One afternoon, I stood in front of the mirror and said out loud, "They didn't love me the way I needed, and that is not my fault." I said it again and again, until something inside loosened, then cracked. It was the beginning of forgiveness, not for them, but for myself. For the girl who waited too long to stop hoping. Healing didn't happen all at once. It was slow and uneven, like learning to walk again after years of limping. But eventually something shifted. The pain, though still present, no longer dictated every move I made, and in its place, something else began to grow. Anger. Not the kind that burns hot and fast. This was cold and focused. It didn't want revenge. It wanted resolution, boundaries, truth. I started small. First, I blocked Danielle on every platform. No more backhanded messages, no more subtle jabs disguised as sisterly advice. Then I changed my number and updated my emergency contacts. My parents were erased from my medical records. I no longer wanted them notified if I was in an accident. That thought used to terrify me. Cutting that last thread? Now, it felt like freedom. Then came the money. For years, I'd helped them quietly, consistently, paid off their credit card debt, covered their car insurance, sent them grocery money, and never once did they say, "Thank you." They expected it, as if I owed it to them for existing, but not anymore. I sent them one final message. All financial support ends now. Please do not contact me again. If you continue to do so, I will seek legal action. Short, cold, final. Their responses came quickly. My mom called me ungrateful. My dad said I was being manipulated by my husband. Danielle accused me of abandoning the family when they needed me most. She even floated the idea of suing me, claiming I'd benefited from money meant for her college fund. A blatant lie. For the first time, I didn't respond. I forwarded every message to a folder labeled "For Lawyer." I wasn't bluffing. But it wasn't just about cutting ties. It was about reclaiming space, physical, emotional, psychological. I redecorated our apartment, took down the old family photos and replaced them with snapshots from our honeymoon. Friends, laughing. My husband and I danced barefoot in the kitchen. I told my boss I was ready to return to work, not as the people pleaser they once knew, but as someone who understood her worth. I set clearer boundaries, said no without guilt. Therapy continued. I started EMDR to process the complex trauma. The sessions were intense, sometimes brutal, but they helped me untangle the lies I'd internalized, that I was hard to love, that I had to earn care by performing, sacrificing, and shrinking. It was in one of those sessions that I finally said the words I'd been too scared to admit. They didn't break me, they just broke their access to me. It became my mantra. In the weeks that followed, my sister went on a public campaign. She posted vague, dramatic messages online about losing people to bad influences and family betrayal. Some extended relatives reached out, parroting her narrative. I didn't explain myself. I didn't justify. I let the silence speak for me. Instead, I focused on building. I started a creative side project, a digital journal for women navigating toxic families. I poured my story into it, anonymized but honest. The messages I received from strangers were overwhelming. I thought I was the only one. Thank you for saying what I couldn't. It reminded me I wasn't alone. None of us are. Meanwhile, my husband and I started looking at houses. It felt symbolic. This idea of a home that was truly ours, built on love, not obligation. We found a small fixer-upper on the edge of town. It needed work, but it had a wide porch and space for a garden. Hope lived there. One afternoon, as we painted the kitchen walls, my phone buzzed. A new number. I let it go to voicemail. It was my mother. Her voice cracked as she spoke. I miss you. I don't know how we got here. Can we talk? I sat with that message for a long time. And then I deleted it. Not out of spite, but clarity. You can miss someone and still know they're not safe for you. That was my power now. Shooting myself again and again without apology. The biggest shift came not from the things I cut off, but from what I began to believe, that I was not broken, that I was worthy just by existing. It sounds simple, almost cliche, but when you've spent your life trying to earn the love that never comes, learning to simply accept love, real love, is revolutionary. I started giving myself the things I once begged from them: grace, patience, and gentleness. I cooked meals that reminded me of joy, not obligation. I listened to music from my childhood, not to cry, but to reclaim it. I no longer flinched when I saw family photos. I saw them as proof that I survived. And maybe most importantly, I allowed myself to be angry still. Anger wasn't a weakness. It was proof that I recognized injustice, that I wouldn't let it slide anymore, that I didn't have to. It was a crisp Sunday morning when the knock came. I wasn't expecting anyone. My husband was at the hardware store, and I was halfway through a mug of coffee, still in pajamas, hair a mess. When I opened the door, I froze. It was my mother. She looked smaller than I remembered. Her eyes darted around, unsure whether she should smile or apologize. I didn't say anything, just stepped aside and let her in. I don't know why. Maybe I needed to see what would happen when the curtain finally dropped. She sat on the edge of the couch like it was unfamiliar terrain. I stayed standing. I've been trying to reach you, she said. I know. She hesitated. I wanted to talk, face to face, no drama, just talk. So we did. For an hour, I listened as she tiptoed around accountability. She spoke of confusion, of how things got misunderstood. She said she hadn't realized how hurt I was, and that she thought I was just being emotional. If she'd known how deeply the wedding mattered to me, they would have made a different choice. I asked her one question: why didn't you come? She looked down. Danielle was having a hard time. She needed us. We didn't want her to feel abandoned. And I did. She blinked as if the idea had never occurred to her. That was the moment I realized it wasn't just favoritism, it was a complete lack of empathy. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just told her the truth. That I had spent my entire life waiting to be chosen. I had bent over backward to earn a place in the family, only to be treated like a second option. That her showing up now didn't erase what happened. She tried to defend herself. We did our best. No, I said, my voice flat. You did your best for Danielle. You tolerated me. Silent. Then she said something I'll never forget. I didn't know how to love you. It wasn't cruel, it was hollow, honest, in a sad, shattering way. I nodded, and then I asked her to leave. Not in anger, in peace. I wish you healing, I said, but I can't carry this anymore. Not for you, not for anyone. She stood, I walked her to the door, and for the first time, I felt taller than her. I didn't watch her drive away. I just closed the door and leaned against it, letting the quiet settle. My hands were trembling, but my chest felt lighter. Later, I wrote in my journal, closure isn't a conversation, it's a choice. That day, I chose myself again. In the weeks that followed, I received a few more tense texts from my father and vague Facebook messages from Danielle, but I didn't engage. I had made my peace. I didn't need their version. I had mine. Strange how people react when you stop playing your role. When the scapegoat puts down the weight, some grow frantic, others lash out, but eventually they fall silent, confused that their old tricks no longer work. And in that silence, I began to thrive. I spent more time with my husband. We worked on the house, grew tomatoes and basil in the garden. I started volunteering at a women's shelter once a week, sharing my story, listening to others. The ache was still there, yes, but it no longer consumed me. Healing is not erasing, it's integrating. And I was finally becoming whole. One night, a few days after the visit, I sat out on the porch under a blanket, listening to the wind in the trees. I thought about forgiveness, what it means, and what it doesn't. People often confuse forgiveness with reconciliation, but they're not the same. Forgiveness is internal. It's deciding not to carry someone else's damage in your body. Reconciliation is earned, and my family hadn't earned it. I also thought about the version of me who once would have begged for that visit, who would have clung to every word, desperate to make it right. That version of me was gone, and I didn't mourn her. I honored her for surviving, for holding on as long as she did. There's a grief in letting go, but there's also a quiet kind of pride, the kind that builds slowly like a muscle, the kind you don't even notice until one day you realize you're no longer flinching, no longer shrinking. You no longer need their love to validate your worth. I wasn't waiting for another apology. I wasn't waiting for a better mother or a more honest sister. I had stopped waiting entirely because I had finally arrived. The last time I saw my father, it wasn't planned. It was a Tuesday afternoon, just after lunch. I had taken the day off to run errands and stopped at a bookstore downtown. I was flipping through a memoir about complicated families when I heard someone say my name. Emily? I turned. There he was, standing by the entrance, holding a paper bag and looking older than I remembered. He smiled, tentative, hopeful. I didn't. We stood there in a strange silence, surrounded by the smell of old books and espresso. Finally, he stepped closer. "I've been trying to find you," he said. "I know. I just want to talk." I hesitated. Then, for reasons I still don't fully understand, I nodded. We sat outside at a little metal table under an awning. He offered to buy me coffee. I declined. Then he started to speak. He talked about the house, how quiet it had become, how Danielle had moved to another city, how the bills were piling up, how he missed me. I listened, but my heart stayed guarded. Then he said something that made me pause. "I didn't know we were losing you until you were gone." There was pain in his voice, maybe real, maybe performative, but it didn't matter. What mattered was what came next. "You always seemed so strong," he said, "like you didn't need us." I took a breath. "That's because I learned not to." His eyes dropped to the table. For the next 20 minutes, I told him things I'd never said out loud, about what it felt like to grow up invisible, about the time he laughed when Danielle mocked me in front of their friends, about the nights I cried myself to sleep because no one noticed I was hurting. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he wiped his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said. "I really am." I believed him, but I also knew it wasn't enough. Because sorry don't rebuild bridges that were never built right in the first place. Sorry doesn't undo the years of silence, the empty chairs, the missed milestones. "I appreciate that," I said, "but I'm not coming back." His face crumpled. "Not even someday?" I shook my head. "You had decades of somedays." We parted with a hug. Not warm, not cold, just final. As I walked away, I felt something shift inside me. Not grief, not anger, something closer to resolve. That night, I told my husband everything. He held my hand while I spoke, then kissed my forehead and said, "You did the right thing." And I knew he was right. His closure isn't always about reunion. Sometimes it's about release. I made my choice that day, not just to walk away, but to walk forward into a life that didn't revolve around trying to prove my worth to people who never saw it, into a love that felt mutual, into friendships that weren't one sided, into joy that wasn't followed by guilt. I finally saw myself not as someone who lost a family, but as someone who survived one. And that I realized was enough, more than enough. In the weeks after that conversation, I found myself replaying it in my head during the most unexpected moments, brushing my teeth, driving alone at night, folding laundry. There were still echoes of doubt, questions I couldn't quiet. Was I too harsh? Had I cut the cord too cleanly? But those thoughts passed quicker each time. Instead, I leaned into my present. I hosted dinner parties with friends who felt more like siblings than Danielle ever did. I got promoted at work and celebrated not with a desperate call to my parents, but with champagne on our porch, just me and my husband and the dog curled at our feet. I started therapy again, not because I was falling apart, but because I wanted to keep growing, to break patterns so that if I ever had children, they wouldn't inherit this legacy of silence and sacrifice. I wrote letters I never intended to send to my mother, my sister, even to myself at 17. I told her she was brave for leaving. I told her she was right to walk away. I told her she deserves softness and strength in equal measure. And I kept choosing peace over and over, not the peace of avoidance or silence, but the peace that comes from no longer needing permission to live fully. Eventually, my father sent one last email, short, honest. I understand. I hope you're happy. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Because for once, I wasn't looking back. I was finally home. If there is one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that family is not defined by obligation or blood. It's defined by choice, by the people who show up, by the ones who don't flinch at your pain, who don't keep score, who don't expect you to dim your light so they can shine. For years, I believed love had to be earned, that I needed to prove myself again and again to people who saw me as an afterthought. I lived in a cycle of striving, hoping that one day they'd see me, that I'd be enough. But the truth is, I always was. They just weren't capable of recognizing it. And that's not a reflection of my worth, it's a reflection of their limits. Letting go of them wasn't the betrayal I once feared, it was the liberation I desperately needed. It wasn't easy, it was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but it gave me back to myself. Now, when I think about family, I think about my husband, my friends, and the women I meet at the shelter who carry their pain with such fierce grace. I think about my therapist who helped me untangle years of confusion. I think about my 17-year-old self standing at the edge of everything she knew, terrified, but moving forward anyway. That's family. There's this myth we're sold, especially in broken families, that love means staying no matter what, that loyalty means silence, that speaking the truth or choosing distance makes you cold or ungrateful. But boundaries are not walls, they are doors. Doors you get to choose who walks through. Doors you can close and lock when necessary. You are allowed to protect your peace. You are allowed to define your own narrative. If you're reading this and you've been made to feel like the problem, like the dramatic one, the sensitive one, the difficult child, I want you to know you are not alone and you are not broken. You are someone who saw the cracks in the foundation. That's not a weakness, it's clarity. And maybe, just maybe, you're the one who will break the cycle. So here's what I'll leave you with. You don't have to keep setting yourself on fire to keep other people warm. You don't have to keep proving your value to people committed to misunderstanding you. You don't have to chase love that hurts. Real love doesn't make you smaller. It makes you whole. You're allowed to choose yourself. Again and again and again. I used to think healing would feel like a grand cinematic moment, a sunrise over the ocean, tears running down my face, some invisible weight finally lifted. But the truth is, it's quieter than that. It's in the mornings I wake up without dread, the meals I cook without apology, the mirrors I look into without flinching. It's in the ordinary moments I once couldn't enjoy because I was too busy trying to be enough for people who never clapped for me. Healing is in the space I've carved for myself, a space where I get to be both soft and strong, angry and kind, flawed and worthy. It's not perfect. Some days I still ache. I still wonder what life might have been like if they had chosen differently, if they had loved better. But then I remember I chose differently. I loved it better, and that's what matters now. So if you're still in the thick of it, if you're still navigating guilt and grief and the gnawing need for approval, this is your permission to let go. Not all at once, but one breath at a time. You are allowed to outgrow the version of you that begged to belong. You are allowed to begin again. You are allowed to be free.